Hello again, and thank you for joining us for this Thursday's edition of Alaska Weather. About 3 weeks through October now in 2022. And moving on, first graphic, there are no watches, warnings, or advisories out anywhere around the state, none in the Bering Sea, certainly not the Aleutians or southern Alaska, as well as the Panhandle, not looking for anything there, and up to the north, advisory watch and warning free, probably for the next couple of days. And moving on to satellite imagery, you can see a front pushing across the Gulf of Alaska in toward the southeast coast, that bringing increasing rain along the North Gulf Coast and the northern Panhandle today, but nothing too terribly heavy, especially in the southeast coast there. Otherwise, clouds in over the Copper River Basin and mid and high level clouds all the way up to the Yukon Flats, with really light precipitation amounts there, and southerly winds keeping it dry in the Copper River Basin for the most part. A little bit heavier precipitation with the cloud batch there coming across northern Cook Inlet and into the Susitna and Matanuska Valley. And then out to the west, can see showers moving onto the southwest coast, that associated with a trough, kind of the leading edge of some colder air aloft. That's coming across the Bering Sea, originated in the Russian Far East, dropping southeastward there out of Russia, taking a turn to the east across the Bering Sea, and some looks like pretty good showers now moving on to the southwest coastal areas. And up to the north, you can see a band of moisture there lifting northward. And that's kind of a boundary between colder air to the north and some warmer air on the southwest winds coming in off the Bering Sea. For example, Nome this afternoon at 3 o'clock had about 40 degrees with light rain. They picked up 1/10 of an inch in the last 12 hours. And half inch, maybe an inch of snow falling at Kotzebue. At the same time, they had about 30 degrees for their temperature. Otherwise, some areas of snow in the interior, Koyukuk Valley. Let's see, Bettles picked up possibly 2 inches of snow, or 1 to 2 inches of snow in the Koyukuk Valley there back to the Kobuk, especially along the southern slopes of the Brooks Range. And then more scattered snow shower activity over the upper Yukon Valley into the Tanana Valley there, mostly over the mountainous terrain. And then rain and snow over south central Alaska, rain at sea level with fairly good amounts falling in the Susitna Valley today, up to half an inch at Talkeetna. Also about a half inch of rainfall at Cordova. Shade more over at Yakutat. They picked up about 2/3 of an inch of precipitation. And then you head down the southeast coast, only 0.03 of an inch falling at Sitka, at Ketchikan. Sitka had about 1/3 of an inch of precipitation, as did Seward. Otherwise, showers scattered moving into the Pribilof Islands, and a little bit more numerous showers with that trough coming onto the southwest coast there. Drying out over the Aleutians, and actually skies clearing out on the east side of Kodiak Island. Kodiak State Airport carrying clear skies this afternoon with gusty west winds. And for tonight, that'll continue. Mostly clear skies, dry conditions, breezy for Kodiak Island. Up into the Barren Islands, decreasing precipitation over the Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet with increasing clearing. Snowfall levels coming down a little bit. Call it mixed precipitation across the Copper River Basin. Precipitation free, Gulkana seeing south winds gusting to, 30 miles per hour. That pushed the temperature up in the lower 40s there. It'll be cooler tonight with less wind, losing the south wind, so snowfall levels probably looking at mostly just snow over the higher valleys there. Stays wet for the North Gulf Coast and wetter for the Panhandle than what you probably saw today as that front pushes in, but it'll be weakening as it does move in. Otherwise, Arctic coast stays breezy. Pretty good winds today out of the east up there along the entire Arctic coast, and a portion of the North Slope, 30 to 35 miles an hour in gusts there. And look for some flurries to continue with areas of fog, but really not much in the way of accumulation. And westerly flow continues across the now northern central Bering Sea. Another weak trough keeps it unsettled along the southwest coast. with rain or rain and snow coming into the Seward Peninsula area and the mid-Yukon River Valley, drying out, showers ending for the Pribilofs with possible clearing periods maybe, and stays dry with light winds over all of the Aleutians, with some clearing periods as well, kind of a weak ridge of high pressure there between the low up over the Russian Far East and other center farther to the south just off the map. Tomorrow, we'll get a warm front with that center that's to the south there, pushes up. That could nudge some rain up to the central and eastern Aleutians late in the day, otherwise looking for some showers, cloudier conditions in the afternoon, with a little bit better chance of some light rain there for the eastern central Aleutian areas. Scattered isolated showers to the Alaska Peninsula. Sunny skies for Kodiak Island with continued gusty west to northwest winds. It'll be diminishing into the afternoon. And partly to mostly sunny Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet. Pick up some clouds in the Susitna-Manuska Valley with rain or snow showers, mostly over the mountainous terrain. Talkeetna's eastward across the Copper River Basin. Snow showers over the eastern interior as well as the central interior areas back to the west. And then that southwest flow off the Bering Sea probably keeps precipitation mostly in the form of rain at sea level, with inland areas, though, be in the form of snow or rain and snow mixed. Not much change for the Arctic coast, maybe a little lighter on the winds tomorrow on the west side. Probably keeping the winds on the east side there with, again, flurries and fog at times anywhere along the Arctic coast into the North Slope areas. And weak trough brings some more moisture into the western Aleutians, but on the day Saturday, see a stronger system enters the far western Bering Sea, the low center just passing across the Komodorsky Islands, shade under 1,000 millibars. So that'll pick up, look for at least small craft advisory level winds, the way it looks at this point in time, with the frontal boundaries there coming in with rain, and that'll start to spread in toward Adak late in the day. Otherwise, Atka looking good. And chance of showers for the Pribilofs, and a much stronger storm coming up to just south of Sitkinak Island and Kodiak, and some pretty good winds with that, possible gusts out of the north to 50 miles an hour for the Alaska Peninsula, and gusty northeast winds for Bristol Bay area there, as well as Kodiak Island. Gale force winds with rain moderate to possibly heavy at times, rain spreading into Kachemak and then Kamishak Bays during the afternoon hours, with dry conditions, partly to mostly sunny and cool for northern Cook Inlet into the Manuska-Susitna Valley, Copper River Basin, even Prince William Sound. Stays mostly sunny over the Panhandle. Just some isolated snow shower activity over the interior, especially in the west, not so much in the east to the Arctic coast, looking dry with diminishing winds up there. And moving on to forecast lows for tonight for the Panhandle, about 40 to 45, upper 30s for the North Gulf Coast, near 40 Kodiak Island, mid-30s Bristol Bay, south central Alaska, dropping down below the frost point for the Susitna Valley, and upper 20s for the Copper River Basin, lower 30s in the Kuskokwim Valley. Highs tomorrow, near 40 for the Kuskokwim Valley, Susitna Valley area, mid-30s Copper River Basin, 40 to 45 south central Alaska, Kenai Peninsula into Valdez, near 50 for Kodiak, and 40s to lower 50s for the Panhandle, followed by lows in the mid to upper 30s to near 40 for the southeast coast, mid-teens, a little chillier now for the Copper River Basin, and 25 to 30 for south central Alaska to lower 30s down toward Homer, lower 20s up in the Susitna Valley, and the Kuskokwim Valley as well, near freezing for Bristol Bay, about 40 for Kodiak, highs near 50 for Kodiak again, lower 50s southern Panhandle, mid-40s to the north, mid-20s for the highs in the Copper River Basin, 35 to 40, mostly in the 30s for the Susitna Valley into Anchorage, and then mid-40s down toward Homer. And for up to the north, Arctic coast in the 20s for your Friday morning lows, teens in the Brooks Range, 20s and 30s south of the Brooks Range, and above freezing toward the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island area. Highs again for Nome near 40, otherwise in the 30s across areas south of the Brooks Range, 20s to near 30 from the Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast. And then Saturday morning lows, teens for the Brooks Range and eastern Arctic coast around 20, lower 20s for the western Arctic coast, mid-20s in around the central interior, Tanana Valley, upper teens for the Yukon Flats area, followed by highs 20s and 30s to mid-30s over the central interior, and the 20s from the Brooks Range to the Arctic coast. Out to the west, lows tonight, 30s, 40s, lower 40s for the Aleutians, followed by highs 40 to 45, most areas, near 50 for Adak, and lows upper 30s to lower 40s, mid 30s for the Pribilof in the southwest coastal areas, St. Lawrence Island as well. And then followed by highs Saturday afternoon. Not too bad. Mid to upper 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, 45 to 50 in the central Aleutians, mid 40s for the Pribilofs, lower 40s for the southwest coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather for Friday morning. IFR, central eastern Arctic coast. Marginal VFR along the Brooks Range. And the central interior, a lot of IFR there from the Seward Peninsula northwest coast eastward to the border across the Copper River Basin and into the Susitna Valley, south central Alaska, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, marginal VFR with IFR for the Kuskokwim Valley, marginal VFR for the southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island, and some VFR for most of the Aleutians, Pribilofs, and the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island VFR, Panhandle, marginal VFR with areas of IFR to the east and southeast. And for the afternoon, IFR kind of dissipates over the interior there, but lingers over the eastern Copper River Basin on up to Northway Tok and over the Yukon Flats there, as well as a narrow band over the western interior up across the northwest coast, Noatak Valley, all of the Kobuk and Selawik valleys there to Kotzebue, and the central Arctic coast IFR. Good VFR breaking out over south central Alaska now, pushing up into the Susitna Valley, Prince William Sound, southern Copper River Basin, marginal VFR there for Yakutat and the Panhandle, and some IFR pushing back into Shimei and Attu, and some IFR edging up to the Fox Islands. For the Saturday morning time frame, we're looking at IFR now right across the Kuskokwim Valley up to the western Alaska Range, northward, Kobuk, Koyukuk, western Yukon Flats area, and then cutting off at the Brooks Range, part of the North Slope there, VFR, and then into the marginal VFR out toward the Arctic coast with IFR for the western Arctic coast, and VFR for the northern Bering Sea, St. Lawrence Island, most of the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, down across the southwest coast and interior into Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, and the Panhandle, good VFR. For the afternoon Saturday, VFR holds over the southeast coast as well as the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and northern Cook Inlet into the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, on up into the Fairbanks area in the Nana, and the Denali Park area, marginal VFR southern Cook Inlet, IFR Kodiak Island, and into Bristol Bay across the Aleutian Range there, southern Kuskokwim Valley. Heavier IFR though for the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, right down to St. Paul, and IFR from Amchitka Island westward to Shimei and Attu. Passes pretty marginal for the Brooks Range tomorrow, both Anatuvik and Anigan. Call it occasional marginal VFR for both passes there. Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR in the forecast also there, either approach, and rainy, same thing, marginal VFR at times. On Friday, windy, marginal. Isabel looks marginal, as well as Mentasta, though that pass, go with IFR there. And for Tanita, marginal VFR early on, trending toward VFR by the middle of the day and into the afternoon especially. Portage, starting out marginal VFR, becoming VFR, probably during the morning hours, continuing through the afternoon. Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 feet across the southern Bering Sea, northern Bristol Bay, North Gulf Coast, right across Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay, 4,000 feet up over the southern Panhandle. And for icing, not too bad. A little bit of icing nudging northward there into the central, maybe eastern Aleutians, but not too bad, and some possible isolated moderate rime icing, maybe even mixed for the Panhandle, as well as the northern Copper River Basin up into the mid and upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country. Jet stream, 150 knot winds right across the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, and it kind of dives just south of Kodiak, clipping Sitkinak Island, and then south of the Panhandle, out of the west to northwest, and at 9,000 feet, looking at west-northwest winds across the central and northern Bering Sea, down across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula Kodiak Island area, and then continuing southeast, just missing the Panhandle. Pretty light up over the interior with an area of weak high pressure, and at 3,000 feet. 40 knots in the Gulf of Alaska there out of the northwest, winds diminishing there over Kodiak Island and the Barrens, southern Cook Inlet. Otherwise, 45-knot winds into the western Aleutians. But the southern Bering Sea, pretty light on the winds, as well as the eastern interior and the panhandle. And from there, turbulence, light to isolated moderate chop, southern Kenai Peninsula through the Barren Islands and down to about Kodiak State Airport there, as well as the western Aleutians. Could be some considerable moderate chop ahead of that front coming into the far western Aleutians.
Oh, hi, on. This episode is about Orion the Hunter and a meteor shower, but you don't have to hunt for it. We've got it for you, Star Fam. Hit the darkness after 1 a.m. on October 21st for the best shot at seeing the shower. Find a spot with a clear view of the eastern sky and look for Orion. He looks like an hourglass with a sparkly belt of 3 stars. His top left star is red giant Betelgeuse, but don't confuse it with bright red Mars. Here. In between Mars and Betelgeuse, if you're lucky, you'll see 15 meteors per hour. They're typically blazing fast and on the fainter side, but if nothing else, you'll get a great view of Mars and Orion. Plus, if you wait long enough and get night vision, the Orionids emanate from Orion's raised club, the feet of the twins of Gemini, and the tip of Monoceros' unicorn horn. Even if you don't see the shower, the stars will be beautiful as always. Keep looking up.
The Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge is a refuge in Alaska. It's the 3rd largest refuge in the National Wildlife Refuge System. North of Fairbanks, it's a vast ecosystem of wetlands. What drives this refuge are natural forces of fire, ice, and water.
The Yukon Flats has got a really interesting history. Back in the late 50s, early 1960s, there was a proposal to dam the Yukon River down by Rampart, which is downstream of the Yukon Flats. And it was a hydroelectric proposal. And so in order to assess the merits of that proposal, people got together because they were a little bit concerned about what the impacts might be on the Yukon Flats, the habitat, and all the people living within the Yukon Flats Refuge. There's quite a few people living within the refuge. We have 7 villages. So in order to figure out how special the Yukon Flats was, the Fish and Wildlife Service banded over 40,000 ducks within the Yukon Flats. And using the band return information, they found out that those ducks were using 45 of the 50 lower 48 states. They were using 7 foreign countries, and they were using most of the provinces over in Canada, as well as all the major flyways down in the lower 48. And so that identified that the Yukon Flats was a special breeding area, and that information, along with a lot of other public information that was gathered during that whole process, really ensured that the dam never did go in, and thus the habitat was preserved.
So what that did is it really highlighted the national importance of this area and how important conserving this particular area is for conserving many other natural areas in the lower 48 and even across the continent.
To protect the Yukon Flats Refuge because we have responsibility towards our future generations to leave land protected in the state that it is now. The Yukon Flats is a wild place. The ecosystem is intact and functioning, and you can't find that very many places in the rest of the U.S.
The Yukon Flats Refuge is among the most important places for ducks. So each spring, millions of ducks, and in addition to shorebirds and geese, raptors and loons, they all fly to the refuge to nest and rear their young. And the reason they are attracted to this area is because it has really enriched wetlands. There are lots of nutrients in the wetlands that provide a lot of food for the growing young.
We also have a lot of predator, prey species like bears and black bears, grizzly bears, wolves. We also have a lot of moose and fur bearers that use the refuge. So overall, there's just a great diversity of both upland, lowland, and migratory bird species that use the refuge.
Most people know the flats as a duck nursery, and that was one of the main purposes that was designed for, but a lot of recent research over the last decade has really illustrated how important it is to a variety of native endemic fish species for subsistence and recreational and commercial fisheries throughout the entire Yukon River Basin and out to supporting commercial fisheries out to the Bering Sea as well. So it supports a variety of different whitefish and salmon species, the northern pike, a little bit of everything that people rely on as cultural identities, but also for subsistence resources and where people go to recreate and enjoy being outside.
The type of recreation that you're going to find on Yukon Flats Refuge is very primitive. And what that often does is it gives people a complete break from some of the stresses of today's world. There are no cell phone towers out there. There are no roads. There are no trails. So any type of recreation that people have is entirely natural. The lands and waters within the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge are open to the public to enjoy. And that's a really important tenet upon which the United States is built.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Moving on to the coastal water forecasts along the panhandle, along the coast. On the south coast, small craft advisories, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots with 15-foot seas. On the north coast, winds will be out of the west 25 to 30 knots with 12 to 14-foot seas. And for Lynn Canal, south winds 15 knots for Friday. Stevens Passage looking at a southeast breeze at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. Clarence Strait, south winds 15 knots, seas 7 feet. And for the first day of the weekend, south coast, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the north coast, east to southeast winds 30 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots, 4-foot seas. East winds at 15 for the central inner channels, and for Clarence Strait, northwest winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Prince William Sound on Friday, northwest winds 20 knots, seas 3 feet. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, west winds 25 knots with 12-foot seas. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, and Kamishak Bay. All three zones there looking at west winds on Friday at 35 knots. Southern Cook Inlet, west winds 30 knots with 9-foot seas. North of the Forelands, much lighter and out of the north at about 10 knots. Saturday, Northern Cook Inlet, north winds 15 knots. Prince William Sound, north winds 15 knots. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, east and northeast winds 25 knots. Northeast winds 30 knots for the Barren Islands. Southern Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots. Kodiak Island, winds will be out of the west on Friday at 25 knots, seas up to 10 feet. For the Alaska Peninsula, west winds 20 to 25 knots, and Bristol Bay looking at 25-knot west winds with 8-foot seas. And for Saturday, for Shelikof Strait, gale warnings, northeast winds at 40 knots. Otherwise, Kodiak Island, winds will be northeast at 30 knots. Gale warnings from Sitkinak to Castle Cape for north to northwest winds 35 to 45 knots. And for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 30 knots. Bristol Bay, north winds at 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, on Friday, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots with 9 to 10-foot seas. Adak and Atka, south to southwest winds at 15 knots. And for the western Aleutians, small craft advisories, south winds 25 knots with 9-foot seas. And for the western Aleutians, gale warnings on Saturday, south to southwest winds 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, west to southwest winds 30 to 45 knots. Central Aleutians, southwest winds at 30 knots. And for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, for Friday, southwest winds 25 knots with 11-foot seas. Southwest coast, west to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, winds will be southwest at 20 knots. And for Saturday, southwest winds 20 knots for the Pribilofs. South winds 25 knots for St. Matthew Island. For the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, winds will be southwest at 20, and 25-knot northwest winds for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. For the eastern Arctic coast, east winds 25 knots, west winds 30 knots for the central and west side, Chukchi Sea, south winds 15 to 20 knots. And for Saturday, from Wales to Cape Thompson, winds will be south at 20 knots. Otherwise, the western Arctic coast looking at southeast winds at 20 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas. Small craft advisories for the central and eastern Arctic coast for east winds at 25 knots with seas around 7 to 8 feet. And for tonight, again, look for some flurries and fog, light snow showers, little accumulation for the Arctic coast north slope. Scattered snow showers along the eastern Brooks Range, a little more numerous with that trough over the western Brooks Range on the southern slopes. Otherwise, rain for the North Gulf Coast, and the front will keep it wet over the Panhandle as it weakens and moves in. Another trough brings unsettled conditions into the southwest coast, and for tomorrow, periods of rain changing to showers over the Panhandle and ending for the North Gulf Coast with some clearing for Kodiak Island, Cook Inlet, and the Kenai Peninsula. Scattered showers up along the Alaska Range and some scattered snow showers over northern Alaska. And southwest flow keeps surges of moisture moving into the Yukon Delta, Norton Sound, and the Seward Peninsula. Stronger storm moves up toward Kodiak with wind and rain, Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island into Bristol Bay on Saturday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.